Welcome to Marriage Law, Practice and Procedure, Video 1. We're in Lesson 7 on Favor of the Faith. Remember, we've had our pyramid that we've been working with all semester, and this is the fourth level from the top in our pyramid. After canonical form, then impediments and documentary process. Middle of the pyramid is Pauline privilege. Second to the last step is where we are. Lesson 7, the favor of the faith. And then our final remaining level will be the formal process. We had just begun Lesson 7 in our last class, which was on March 16th. And we'd begun with the history of the favor of the faith. So we're going to continue there. We're just in this video, we're just going to complete the history. We'll recap what we did last time, and then we'll do another video which will go through the norms of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on how favor of the faith cases go forward. Okay, so this is the history of favor of the faith cases, or favor fidei cases, and our main text here is Coel Westman, pages 81 to 90, but also the Kennedy article on dissolution. As we discussed, favor of the faith cases kind of come about first in light of the age of exploration in the 16th century. So our first very important documents are three documents by three popes in the 16th century: Paul III, Pius V, and Gregory XIII. We went over the names last time. If you need those, they're in the sources, or you can email me, but you don't really have to know the names for our purposes. What they stand for is a dissolution marriage beyond the fact situation that applies for the Pauline privilege. And as we said, this often is encountered in the age of exploration. So one issue is going to be a baptized party who wants to enter a new marriage. The first spouse also has been baptized, but they have not lived together since then. So they may have consummated the marriage before it was a sacramental marriage. That is, since both became baptized, they have not consummated. So dissolution is possible here. And then, as we also discussed, there is the situation of polygamy, in which the polygamous person, usually the male, usually the husband, is permitted to choose one of the spouses if he can't remember which one was the first one, etc. And we kind of talked about that last time. So our the 16th century is kind of important for the beginning of favor of the faith. Keep in mind, the terminology doesn't become clear for a long time. For a long time, even though we look back and we discuss these as favor of the faith cases, they sometimes were referred to as kind of an extension of the Pauline privilege. So it's going to be not until about the middle of the 20th century that the terminology becomes clear and becomes the terminology that we recognize today. So in 1917, with the 1917 Code, what happens is these 16th century papal norms that essentially were written for the age of exploration and for those situations of Christianity encountering non-Christian religions, those norms are applied to the whole church. So this possibility of greater use of the Pope's dissolving power becomes more of a possibility. Okay. Our first case of, again, what we look back and we'll call favor of the faith in the sense that we're referred to it, that we refer to it now, um, leaving aside the age of exploration cases, are kind of our first case that we look at as a favor of the faith case is exactly 100 years ago. That's the Zaire case in 1920, then called the Belgian Congo. And in that case, again, this at the time was not called favor of the faith, but you'll see the parallels pretty easily. Now, this is discussed in a different article, McCormick, which I believe I sent you. I'll check. If I did not send it to you, I will send it to you. But in the Zaire case, two pagans had married, then they had divorced. One received non-Catholic baptism, and the other converted to Catholicism and petitioned for dissolution, so to enable marriage to a Catholic. And in that case, the petition was granted. It was granted to the one who had, the pagan who had become Catholic, had been baptized, to enable, and I don't know if it was the husband or wife, but to enable him or her to marry another Catholic. Now, again, at the time, this may have been discussed as an extension of the Pauline privilege. We don't look at it now as a Pauline privilege type case. Why not? Because the spouses did not remain. Usually in a Pauline privilege case, the spouses, they start out both unbaptized, and then one becomes baptized, but the other does not. So that's why our relatively new favor of the faith cases are going to be different than Pauline privilege cases. Okay, our second case is from Breslau, Germany in 1924. Germany in 1924, that part of Germany now is part of Poland. What happened in the Breslau case? There, a non-Catholic Christian woman married a Jewish man. They later divorced. The woman converted to the Catholicism, and she wanted to marry a Catholic man. Again, could this be a Pauline privilege case the way we currently understand the Pauline privilege? No, it could not. Why? Because the Pauline privilege starts with both spouses being unbaptized, and here only one of the spouses, the Jewish husband, was unbaptized. The woman was a non-Catholic Christian. In this case, she was allowed to take advantage of the privilege. She's a Christian already, but she wants to become Catholic. She wants to marry a Catholic man, and she is allowed to take advantage of the privilege, so her marriage is dissolved so that she can marry a Catholic man. What was the case called, the Breslau case? We don't know. We don't know if it was called an extension of the Pauline privilege or something else. We're just not sure. Okay, then our next big case is the same year, Helena, Montana, here in the U.S. in 1924. Very important, very, very famous case. In this one, there's an unbaptized man, the husband, marries an Anglican woman. Then they get a civil divorce. Now the man, he's unbaptized, but he wants to become Catholic, and he wants to marry a Catholic woman. Now, his first wife had already remarried in the meantime. And what's important about this case, and this is mentioned in the McCormick article that I mentioned, this is the first time that the petitioner is the unbaptized person. This man, he was married to an Anglican woman, but he was unbaptized. But now he is the petitioner. Usually it's going to be the party, like in the Breslau case, this woman who had converted to Catholicism was the petitioner. She's the one asking the Pope for the favor of dissolution. Here it's actually an unbaptized husband asking for dissolution of his marriage so that he can become Catholic and marry a Catholic woman. Could it be a Pauline privilege case? No, because again, it does not begin with two unbaptized people. The man had been married to an Anglican woman. This was during the reign of Pius XI, and he granted the dissolution, and in his decree, he uses the phrase favor of the faith, in favorem fidei. So he says, I'm granting this dissolution in favorem fidei. I'm favoring the faith of this man who wants to become Catholic, or maybe already by now is Catholic, and wants to marry this Catholic woman. Okay, 10 years later, what happens? We're still in the reign of Pius XI, and we get an instruction from the Holy Office in 1934, and this instruction uses the term favorem fidei. Again, we're starting to use this in the 20s and 30s. We're starting to use this this term, favor of the faith, though again, the usage is not established entirely yet. Now, this instruction, two interesting things. First, again, this is the 1934 Holy Office instruction. The Holy Office is now called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which you probably knew. Two interesting things about this instruction. First, it is reserved. It's not made public. We already, by Pius XI's reign, we have the AAS, the Acta Apostolica Sedis, where official papal documents are published. This one is not published. It's sent to the bishops around the world, but it's to some degree kept confidential. Why is that? The answer we're given, which may or may not be satisfying to you, but the answer is to avoid misreading by the media. People may not understand. They may think that divorce is legitimate if we just put this instruction out there and let anyone read that. That seems to be the reason. So that's one interesting thing about the instruction, that it's reserved. The other thing is that, like we had with the Hellenic case, where there's an unbaptized person petitioning, here in this instruction, what we're told is that can go forward. An unbaptized petitioner can petition, but they have to convert. They can only be the petitioner in a favor of the faith case if they already have converted to Catholicism, or if they plan to do so. Okay, our next development is in 1941, and this is an address by Pius XII to the Roman Rota in 1941. Now, as I think you know, every year, usually early in the year, the Pope addresses the judges of the Roman Rota. Those judges are called auditors. Auditor in the rest of canon law has a different meaning, but with the Rota, historically, the judges are called auditors. And so there's this talk every year that the Pope gives to the Roman Rota, and it's usually short, but it can be very important. And in 1941, Pius talked about these types of cases. He didn't describe any name given to them. So here already, still, as late as the 1940s, it's not totally established that we're going to call these favor of the faith cases, even though his predecessor Pius XI used that term. What Pius XII says is that the standard that the Pope uses in deciding whether he's going to grant the dissolution, the standard is the good of souls, the salus animarum, S-A-L-U-S, animarum, A-N-I-M-A-R-U-M. That is how the Pope decides, would this be good? Would this promote the health of souls? Okay. Now then, our next development, the last one on this card, the Fresno case, a very famous case, again from the U.S. and California in 1947. What's so important about the Fresno case? Well, in this one, the marriage actually happened in the church. The marriage that was being dissolved had happened in the church between a Catholic woman and a Catholic man and an unbaptized woman, they got a dispensation from disparity of cult so that they could marry. Um, and this is the marriage that's dissolved. It's unusual because the marriage had actually taken place under the church's own auspices, which usually had not been the case up to now. Here, there are some very specific facts that lead to the dissolution here. It started out as a non-consummation case, but they were not totally sure about the non-consummation. And when I say they, I mean I think the decision makers. They weren't totally sure that the proof was good enough for a non-consummation case. Again, this goes back to our discussion about non-consummation, how difficult those cases can be. Also, the woman remained unbaptized during the entire marriage. And this is important because they realized that it was definitely not a sacramental marriage because one of the spouses never did become baptized. So that's what. But as I say, what's important here is that it actually had been a marriage that took place within the church with a dispensation from disparity of cult. But when the favor is granted in the Fresno case, what's emphasized are these particular circumstances, the possible non-consummation and the lack of baptism. Okay, moving on. 1950, we have a new dimension in these cases. Here we've got an unbaptized woman. This is gonna sound somewhat similar to the Fresno case. An unbaptized woman marries a Catholic man, but in a civil ceremony, not in the church, as in Fresno. And the marriage later is validated. Okay, now it's sounding more like Fresno, because how is it validated? Well, you have to get the dispensation from disparity of cult. That allows the marriage to be validated. But later they divorce. And the woman, the unbaptized woman, later is baptized, and now she is seeking permission to enter a new marriage in the church. Her request is granted, and also her first husband is allowed to marry an unbaptized woman. Her first husband had been Catholic. Why is this case noteworthy? Well, it may not sound noteworthy at first because it's quite similar to the Fresno case. But what's noteworthy is the Fresno case had these very special circumstances. The woman remained unbaptized, and it was a possible non-consummation case. Here you don't have those specific facts. So this is telling us that the Fresno case, even though it's kind of decided in light of these special facts, now by 3 years later in 1950, the Holy Father is saying, I'm willing to dissolve marriages on the basis of the Fresno facts, if it will promote the salus animarum. Question arises, can the Pope, this is a question that comes up in Pius XII's pontificate, long pontificate, 1939 to 1958. Can the Pope dissolve a marriage if both spouses remain unbaptized? A lot of canonists thought that the answer was no. The Pope could not dissolve a marriage purely between unbaptized people. There's a famous canonist in Rome named Capello, Cappello, and that was his opinion. However, Pius XII actually granted dissolution in this situation, and even after his reign was over, people continued to debate whether he was correct to do that. The Holy See for a long time was hesitant to take those cases where both spouses were unbaptized, but the practice became more common under Paul VI. Paul decided, no, it is okay to take these cases, at least under certain circumstances. What Cowell and Westman point out on 85 is that there's an insight here about the understanding of the church, that we're not looking at the church so much as a kind of on the parallel with a jurisdiction like the state, but we're looking at it as the universal sacrament of salvation. So this leads to a greater awareness of possibly a broader extent of the Pope's ability and his ministry, even to the unbaptized. Okay, Pius XII's pontificate ends in 1958. During his pontificate, as we just said, several non-sacramental marriages had been dissolved to let an unbaptized petitioner marry a Catholic, even though the unbaptized person did not him or herself intend to become baptized. And John the 23rd continues this policy. Now, Paul VI is going to change things. Paul VI, he's going to say it's okay to take a case like this where the parties are unbaptized, but we're only going to grant the favor if the unbaptized petitioner is planning to become Catholic. So that's the only circumstance where we're actually going to grant the privilege. So this is now we're talking, Paul VI is Pope from 1963 to 1978. So this is going to be the policy in the late 60s and early 1970s. And in fact, the Holy Office in the early 1960s writes to several English-speaking countries, including the US and Australia and New Zealand. And it says, don't send any, this is actually kind of a different issue, but it says, don't send us any more cases about disparity of cult, like the Fresno case, if the new marriage also is going to require disparity of cult. So if you're the Catholic, you had gotten a dispensation to marry an unbaptized person in your first marriage. That didn't work out. You're divorced. The Pope, you ask the Pope to dissolve it. He'll entertain your request, but not if your new marriage is to another unbaptized person. You have to be marrying. You have to be marrying at least a Christian, and hopefully a Catholic. We don't want to have you having gotten two dispensations from disparity of cult. Why is that? Not sure. Not really explained. I think just because it might look kind of unseemly to have sort of two dispensations for the same thing, and neither one works out, or the probably the judgment is, look, your first marriage probably failed because you're of different religions, and now you're trying to go into the same situation again. I think it's probably something along those lines. So in the early 1970s, again, this is Paul's policy, Paul VI, his policy. You're going to have to, if a non-Catholic party is the petitioner in a favor of the faith case, he or she is going to have to convert, or promise to convert, or state an intention to convert to Catholicism in order to obtain the favor. In 1973, we have norms from Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, this document called Ut Notum Est. Again, though, as with the 1934 instruction of Pius XI, it is not published in the Acta. In fact, it is sent discreetly to ordinaries. Again, think about that. Does that make sense? This is an important marriage type of case, and we're not willing to have the norms out there and be public. Is that okay? Is that prudence? Or do you think that they should be public? That's just something I think you're entitled to think about. Now, as of 1973, with these new CDF norms in 73, the Pope will, policy changes, the Pope will dissolve a marriage between two unbaptized persons to allow one of them to marry in the church, even if the petitioner is not intending to become Catholic. So Paul's policy changes somewhat. There can be a dissolution with an unbaptized petitioner, and the unbaptized person wanting to marry a Catholic, even if that person, the unbaptized petitioner, does not intend to become Catholic himself. In 1983, as you know, we get the new code of canon law. Favor of the faith is only mentioned in passing in 1150, and really it's left for other norms outside of the code to address these types of cases. Again, why do that? Maybe it's the same reason that we had with the 73 norms being reserved and the 1934 instruction being reserved. Maybe it's just something that the Holy See does not want a whole lot of people to be aware of. And then in 2001, we get new norms on these types of cases. As I told you, the 73 norms were called ut notum est. The 2001 norms, which we're still operating under, are called potestas ecclesiae, and that is what is going to be the subject of our next video. We'll go through those norms and discuss how these cases actually proceed. If you have any questions, please email me or contact me in some other way, and I will see you on our next video. Thank you.